Boa noite a todos. Então, vamos dar início à aula inaugural do Centro de Estudos Luís Guedes, que hoje conta com a presença da professora Myrna Weissman, que vai nos dar uma aula sobre... Myrna, I'm speaking in Portuguese. First, I'm doing an introduction in Portuguese, and then you are going to start, okay? Então, a professora Myrna vai dar uma aula sobre aspectos gerais da terapia interpessoal. Eu vou fazer uma breve apresentação da professora Myrna. Myrna, I'm going to introduce you in English, and then you start your lecture. Dr. Myrna Weissman is chief of the Division of Epidemiology at New York State Psychiatry Institute. She received a PhD in chronic disease epidemiology from Yale University, worked with Gerald Clareman in developing interpersonal psychotherapy as one of the first evidence-based treatments for depression. IPT is defined in a manual and now has over 140 clinical trials, numerous transitions and adaptations. Her book, outlining the method, has been translated into 5 languages. An international society of researchers and clinicians using IPT was formed several years ago. She has been the author and co-author of over 100 scientific articles and chapters and 12 books, and the most recent being the Guide to Interpersonal Psychotherapy. Myrna has received numerous awards, and her accomplishments include but not limited the Hema Lampus Award for significant contributions to psychiatry epidemiology in 1985 and Joseph Zubin Award for Life Achievement for the Society for Research in Psychopathology. Also, in the same year, she was selected by the American College of Epidemiology as one of the 19 epidemiologists in the United States who has had an impact on public and policy and health. Her current research is on understanding the rates and risks of mood and anxiety disorders, using method of epidemiology, genetics, neuroimaging, and the application of this finding to develop the test empirically based treatments and prevention intervention, and the implementation of psychotherapy in low-income countries and populations. Now she directs 3-generation study of families in high and low risk for depression who has been studied clinically for up to 25 years and who are participating in genetic and imaging studies. Also, she directs a study of psychiatric disorders in poor and minority patients populations in primary care. Her current interest in bringing psychiatric epidemiology closer to translational studies in the neurosciences and genetics. We are very proud of having her with us today. It's an enormous happiness that I introduce and thank Dr. Myrna Weissman to give her lecture on overview of IPT here in Porto Alegre. Now, Myrna, you can start your lecture.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rocha. I'm honored to be invited to speak in Brazil. I've been in Brazil 3 times. I hope to return, and it's an honor to welcome the 2023 academic year of the residents. I hope you can hear me. What I'm going to do is give you a little bit of the history and a little bit of what IPT is, and try to tell you where we are now. And I hope I can do it fast enough to leave time for some questions, because I would like to interact with the residents if possible. The background. In the 60s, it's hard to believe, medications for depression were widely being tested. There were rating scales. There was great excitement with the medication. There was outpatient treatment, not ambulatory treatment. And there were laws requiring that medication had to have proof of efficacy. So a whole field of psychopharm trials began. The problem was that psychotherapy was the most common treatment. And the conventional wisdom was you couldn't test psychotherapy. And in fact, there was a lot of skepticism as to whether psychotherapy had any benefit at all. In the 70s, Aaron Beck of cognitive therapy in Philadelphia and Gerald Claremon, who was then in New Haven, then went to Boston, to Harvard, transformed the research and practice of psychotherapy. Beck was influenced by cognitive psychologists, and Jerry by running the first multi-site clinical trial of medication, amitriptyline, for the maintenance treatment of depression. And they started about 40 years ago writing scripts independently, but as friends, for what became CBT and IPT. Jonathan Rush and I later joined as their research assistants. Well, we've come a long way since then. And although in the 60s there were no trials, by 1979 there were 17 clinical trials. 1982, there was a very important study which tested the difference between IPT and CBT and medication. And then there were other things along the way. In 2017, there were 130 trials of IPT, and at my last count, there were about 145, and that doesn't count China, which is doing clinical trials right now and just submitted their first paper on them. In 2021, the organization, the International Organization of IPT, has representation from 28 countries. And in 2024, I hope some of you will be able to go to the International IPT Congress, which will be held in the United Kingdom. So there's been a lot happening. And in 2003 was the first trial in sub-Saharan Uganda in Africa. And that's led to a great deal of work going now in Africa on IPT. So what is it all about? The basic idea is that IPT assumes there's a relationship between the disruption of a close attachment through death, through disagreements, through life changes, through loneliness and isolation, and the onset and the recurrence of symptoms such as depression or distress. These triggers are conserved across cultures, as we have now shown quite dramatically as we've pursued IPT use in other countries, including we have a nice chapter from Brazil. Now, this doesn't say anything about the cause of depression, but it does say what is associated with the onset of symptoms. And this is a simple chart, but we know that there's an interaction between the genetics and the environment, but that these are the triggers: grief, disputes, transitions, isolation, that leads to the phenotype of distress, depression, or anxiety, plus other things, of course, medical conditions too. So what are the phases? And this is very simple. It's going to be, you're not going to learn how to do IPT from listening to this lecture, but I will show you how you can get much more detailed information if you're interested. In the initial phase, there's an introduction. We identify the symptoms and the treatment history, nothing unusual there. explain the symptoms of distress and how they related to a current problem in the person's life. And then we give the patient the sick role, which we're now calling the recovery role. And that is to give the patient a chance to relax, sit back, and give themselves time to get well, to take care of themselves. People objected throughout the world on sick role, and we've now changed that to recovery role. The concept is the same, but the name is different. We do an interpersonal inventory, which means we don't go back to the childhood, but we try to find out who is important in the patient's life, who is giving them a lot of trouble, and who is a great source of support. And then we determine the key problem areas, which we call grief, disputes, transitions, loneliness, or isolation. Patients can have one or two, as many as they like. They can change these problem areas. And of course, as clinicians, you know, they're highly interrelated. But it gives us a focus to work on a therapy. And then we explain the procedures, the time limit. The time can vary, and it depends mostly on finances and patients' wishes and therapist availability. We've done therapy for 6 sessions to 3 years, but it's important, we think, to specify the time limit so that at an end of a certain period of time, we can see how is this patient doing? And is the treatment working, or do they need something added? The problem areas come directly from the work we had been doing on life events, showing the association between life events and the onset of symptoms. Amazing, in the countries that we've been working in, now 30 of them, the problem areas work pretty well. There's grief, which is complicated bereavement following a death. Disputes, conflicts with significant others in renegotiation, dissolution, or impasse. Transitions, changes in life, divorce, relocation, retirement, illness, winning the lottery. They can be good changes too, but they may have an impact. Deficits, loneliness, and isolation, either recent because of a change in one's personal situation, or patients who've never been able to acquire many friends. In the middle session, we review the symptoms and the problems since the last session. We work on strategies for solving the problem, and we try to choose a problem with the patient that's manageable in brief terms. In the manuals, there are scripts so that you get some idea of what we're talking about. This is just a brief summary, of course. And there's our problems. And a description. And some of the questions. Now, this is not like a rating scale. The things are written down and you ask those questions. The questions and the scripts are meant to give a guide to the clinician as to how to broach the subject. Has someone close to you died? Who was it? Tell me a little about them. How did she or she die? And how are you dealing with it? These are obvious questions, of course. For disputes, an argument with someone significant, they can be open, fighting openly, or more hidden, and becoming distant or cold in the relationship. Are you and someone else having a strong disagreement? Is it bringing you pain? Tell me about it, and tell me how it's affecting you. Life changes, again, positive or negative transitions, already experienced or anticipated. Has there been any changes in your life that have impacted you? These changes could be good or bad. Divorce, separation, having a child, getting married, illness. What's important and how has it affected you? In fact, in one of the projects that we're just starting in primary care, we're going to be working on these questions to give the primary care doctor a lexicon as to how they might get into finding out why a patient is distressed, even though, and the distress is not necessarily related to the medical condition they've come for. And loneliness is the absence of close relationships, feelings of loneliness or emotional distance from others. It could be lifelong or more recent. And here's just some strategies for dealing with the problem. And in the manuals, there are scripts to deal with these strategies, and they're spelled out in much more detail. The termination should be based on what was agreed upon in the beginning. And here you deal with the feelings of ending, the progress and strategies for identifying and dealing with recurrences, and whether more treatment needs. Now we're very eclectic. We have made recommendations for CBT after IPT. We've made recommendations for having medication. There's no contraindication for having medication if one is receiving IPT. In fact, the studies show that for moderate to severe depression, patients with combined medication and IPT do better than either treatment alone. Now, over the years, we have tried to simplify the script. I know you haven't seen the scripts, and I'm not really going to go into it today, but I'll show you how to read them if you want. And we have modified them and tried to make them simpler as possible. In the United States, particularly, there's increasing use of people who are not physicians doing IPT and people who are not psychologists even doing IPT, and even people who are not educated in mental health, but become community health workers. So we have tried to make the script simpler and simpler. And we began that in 1983, developing interpersonal counseling, which is briefer in duration and the number of sessions. And in fact, we liked the scripts and how we simplified them so well that we've introduced these in our regular manual. But we do keep this, and it has been used in digitalized in some places. And we have used these especially for training community health workers with a no necessarily formal education beyond high school. Now, there have been many efforts to do reviews to see if these treatments work. And just to show you some of them, this is one, I haven't updated it recently. And this is a study done by Pim Coopers, who makes his living on doing scoping reviews and meta-analysis. And he at that point had 90 studies with over 11,000 patients. And this was his conclusion. It's that it was effective in the prevention of new depressive disorders and preventing relapse. It might be effective in the treatment of eating disorders and anxiety disorders, and has shown some promise in other mental disorders. It actually doesn't work very well for primary substance abuse. There's been 2 trials in which it hasn't done very well. And we would recommend if one is treating a patient with comorbid substance abuse and depression, treat the substance abuse first and then the depression, you could use IPT. But IPT is a standard treatment just for substance abuse. I think 2 negative trials is enough to say this is not the treatment for that. There are some excellent results with PTSD, and John Markowitz has a book on his experience in treating patients and a manual for PTSD. The results for eating disorders are good. Initially, CBT is better in the beginning, but at the end, I think IPT came out a little bit better. So they're about equal, and it depends on the patient and the availability of the personnel. But for depression, I think the results are overwhelmingly positive. And this is the 2016 review. Paula Ravitz from Canada, and I'm not part of this one, which is, I think, good. I shouldn't be an author of reviews evaluating a treatment I developed. And this was a review that covered 1974 to 2017. It's a huge review, and she again came out with very positive results. And there's been others. There's one recently done by Tim Cooper, and there's one actually in press from China. So let me take you to what I think is the most exciting new work that's been going on, the global reach outside of the United States. We were invited by people from Uganda. It was actually a missionary, I believe, to try to help with the problem of depression. Depression was recognized by the community as a major source of disability, which they felt had to be addressed, and the traditional healers were unable to do it. Medication was not feasible. The cost was too high, and they had very few physicians. And they wanted psychotherapy that was manualized, evidence-based, but compatible with the local culture. We had absolutely no idea whether IPT would be compatible with the local culture, but it certainly was worth trying. And we did. And the results of this trial, 30 villages in Masaka and in the capitals was selected using a random procedure, 15 men and 15 women. Men and women could not be in the same group, and a group approach was used. And our group revised the manual to make it simpler. And also we trained the therapists in Uganda. We had a team that went out there, but we had nothing to do with the clinical trial because we wanted to make sure that it was kept honest. And of course, we wanted to see it look good. But we wanted to be kept away from having any possibility of making the data look better or different than it was. So we were the trainers and we were the manualizers, but we did not conduct the clinical trial. We were authors because of that portion of our contribution. And these were the results, and I won't bore you with all of them, but first of all, the paper was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is quite an honor. And what we showed essentially that at baseline, the patients who received IPT and the patients that got the control group was whatever they had, which wasn't very much, traditional healers. And they were the same. And at termination, there were huge differences with IPT showing much lower depression scores. And these were results that were maintained at 6-month follow-up. So, and there were many papers and work that came out of that, but that's the major story. Well, we were pretty darn proud of this, and we congratulated ourselves. And about 6 months later, there was an article in the New York Times, and I thought that was interesting. Group therapy helps ease the burden of AIDS in Uganda. And I thought somebody else is doing a study in Uganda. That's great. But we read this, and what it turns out is that the New York Times did not believe our study. They couldn't believe that we had treated these people in Uganda with an American-grown psychotherapy, and it had results. So they sent a group of investigative reporters out to the community where we had done the treatment, and they interviewed them. And they found out it was real legit, that it really did help. Now, it was, they did not look at our outcomes, which were depression reduction and social functioning improvement, but they concentrated on the fact that many of these people were AIDS sufferers or were family members of AIDS sufferers. Well, this work got a lot of attention. And we had intended to offer it since it turned out that it was effective. We felt we had an obligation to offer it to others. And we had trained a group of therapists who could provide IPT in Uganda. And we started to, to help to ensure that the treatment could be disseminated. Well, Sean Mabry had a far better idea. Sean Mabry was a former diplomat working in this area, and he wanted to do some good. And he took our manual, he took our trained people, and he developed and started offering free group IPT in Uganda, and something called Strong Minds. Strong Minds now, that was in 2010, I believe. Now, 21 years later, he's treated, about 10 or 15 years later, he has treated over 200,000 people, only women. He hasn't done the men. And he is now, and during the pandemic, he developed methods using cell phones because people may be poor and not have running water, but everybody has a cell phone. And he has continued this through Uganda and Zambia now. And he has just started last year a similar program in Newark, New Jersey, which is a place of great poverty. He is planning to keep up the work in Uganda and also transfer it to poor places in the United States. We did another trial in Uganda after this with adolescents, and these are adolescents living in the north of Uganda, and they had been subjected to some terrible situations. And we had the same effect, a very positive effect on the girls, but the effect on the boys was only marginal. And we felt they were too battered and bruised to have a recovery in the period of the psychotherapy. They showed some improvement with IPT, but nothing like the girls. So let me tell you what we're doing now. The pandemic hasn't been all that bad for some things. And I found myself in 2020 when they closed down Columbia and we had to go and work remote, that we had a lot of extra time. We weren't traveling, we weren't commuting to work. And unfortunately, we also were not having any social activities because the rules were very strict and all of us were very concerned about the pandemic, especially before vaccination. I had a contract to update the IPT manual with Oxford Press. And I had time and I started to explore where I had heard IPT was being used in different parts of the world. And I started emailing people, and I guess a lot of people there who also had time on their hands. And we just sent out for the final typing a book called Interpersonal Psychotherapy, The Global Reach. We have also got agreement from Oxford Press to make this open access. So this book will be free of charge. After we were able to get people from sometimes very poor countries participate, there was no way we were going to have a book that they would have to pay $90 for. And we convinced Oxford Press that this was a very good strategy. So we hope it's going to be published in 2023. We're working hard to get the typing and final papers done. And if not in 2023, it'll be very early in 2024. And the message of IPT is that human attachments are critical to well-being. There's severance through deaths, disputes, life changes, or the absence of attachments is associated with distress. This simple truth holds across different cultures and situations and is a reflection of our common humanity. IPT, and I stress this, it's just one method in an evidence-based toolbox to repair these human fractures. And that's the message of this book. And this is where we have chapters from. We have descriptions. The chapters from the United States mostly deal with special populations because IPT developed in the United States. Now, I'll show you some of those. And in Canada, well, they've done a huge amount of work in trying to make digital and self-guided versions. But look in Africa. We actually have chapters from Ethiopia, Kenya, Mozambique, Senegal, Uganda, and Zambia. We're very proud of that. In Asia, China, Hong Kong, Japan, Nepal, Malaysia. In the Middle East, Iran, Israel, Turkey. In Europe, Finland, France, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Netherlands, Russia, Scotland, Switzerland, Ukraine. We got the man who was in charge in Ukraine just before he fled, and he's in Europe someplace. But we were helped by some of the people who had worked with him from Scotland and from the UK, who were able to help us finish. And in fact, he wanted to train more people by Zoom and IPT. And there was training going on at Columbia at the Teachers College. And we were able to get together a fund to sponsor some of their therapists for further training. In Oceania, we have Australia and New Zealand. And in South America, we have a chapter de Malo from Brazil and Colombia. And these are some of the special populations that we got from, mostly these are all from the US. We have a chapter on pre-adolescence that of course involves a lot of parents. The work on adolescence has been done by Laura Muffson, and she's got several books on IPT with adolescents, and she's quite a pro on this. We have one on prevention of weight gain in African-American girls, adolescents. Chip Reynolds, who's a geriatric psychiatrist, wrote us a chapter on older adults. We have one on Hispanic and Latino, and that's in the United States. One on American Indians and Alaskan Natives. I think we have two on perinatal and postpartum depression. We have John Markowitz on PTSD, and we have a chapter on nurse-delivered IPT, and we have two more, which I don't think made the slide, and one is on transsexual individuals, and the other was IPT in prisons. So these are all separate chapters written by people who are experts. These are the books. Now, this book you have to pay for. And that one has the efficacy data, and it has its use in different disorders. This one we give away free. It doesn't have all of the background, but it's just the manual. And if you write to me, send me an email, I just send it to you. And it does have scripts, and I think it's been used by a lot of people. This is the one that we gave to the World Health Organization, and they put it in their own format. We didn't know why they had all men there, since most of the groups we had done were women, but anyway, that's what they did. And this is also free of charge. And if you write to me, send me an email, I'll send it to you. And this is what I'm working on now, which is a single session IPT, and I'll tell you something about that soon. So what did we learn? Brief treatment is valued. In the United States, having psychotherapy and seeing your therapist once a week and therapy for a long time is highly valued. it is not highly valued in most places. And I think it was only Nepal said, we think we should have longer periods. Most of them thought it was better to have shorter. This task shifting in opposite directions. There was a great interest in training community health workers and also an interest in training primary care doctors, at least to get some of the ideas of IPT. There needs to be graduate programs to train on evidence-based psychotherapy. In the United States, most of the training is in non-evidence-based psychotherapy. The national organization needs to do something about certification because many of the countries, especially the European countries, felt they needed to have certification in order to justify remuneration. Telephone and videos are here to stay. The sick role needs a new name. The concept can remain, and we've already renamed it. Religion is a communal activity and a resource in some countries. And we have no hesitation about using the church and the pastor as a referral and a source. Elders are an important part of treatments, not only as conveyors of information, but of supports in many countries. And in our country, anyone over the age of 17 is considered an adult, and you can't have a parent in the room with the child because unless you got a lot of permission. In some countries, that was considered absurd that the parents had to be there. And refugees are a worldwide problem with transition and grief, the overwhelming problem area, which should be no surprise. There's a real increase in psychiatric problems at the United States, and many patients first appear in primary care. And the doctor's told to be supportive. Well, be supportive is a very black box. What does that mean? Bring cookies? Be sweet, be nice. What does it mean? What do you say? What do you cover and what do you uncover? And we've been working on the language of IPT as a single session to, we're going to be trying that out soon, to give a language to doctors in primary care who meet patients who are very stressed, and this is invading the treatment, the medical treatment. So let's just go back to what the elements of IPT are, because that's what we would be training. First of all, medical model. You're a person with an illness, distress, symptoms. It's not your fault. Take care of yourself, and who can help you? You were trying to solve a problem, bringing on symptoms. Who's in your life, the good and the bad? And this is the kind of thing that we are going to recommend you need to get to know to help uncover why a person is having stress. And some of the symptoms related to any of these problems as we've defined them. We target symptom reduction and improve social functioning, not personality. There's never been evidence you can change personality. We don't have that as a goal. A specified time limit and a focus on the here and now. That doesn't mean that we don't know that early childhood experiences have a profound effect, but we want to help the person in the here and now. So if those of you are interested in IPT, please join. You'll meet all sorts of interesting people from all over the world, and it's not very expensive. If you have difficulty with the cost of dues, let us know. Dues are $50 to students and individuals from low and middle income countries, which are not an option to apply. And what is the final message? That strong social relations are what make a happy life, more than wealth, IQ, or social class. The strength of our bonds determine whether we feel fulfilled. And this has come from a new study from Harvard. I think it's a 50-year study in which undergraduates and people from the community in Cambridge were studied in order to understand what makes people function well and what makes them dysfunction. And this is what came out this year in The Good Life, Lessons from the World's Longest Scientific Study of Happiness. I want to emphasize a variety of psychosocial interventions play a major role in the treatment of mental health and substance abuse conditions. IPT is not the only one. They have been demonstrated to be effective in research settings. They're not used routinely in clinical practice, although this is changing, and it certainly is changing in places like Africa. There's no standard system in place to ensure that the interventions delivered to patients, consumers are effective. And training of community health workers is very effective in low-income countries. I think it would be effective in high-income countries as well, because a lot of high-income countries have people with not enough money to pay, and our insurance system certainly doesn't pay for psychotherapy. I want to dedicate this book and also my presentation to my late husband, Gerald Clareman, whose early death in 1992 prevented him from seeing the endurance and global reach of his ideas. He would have been pleased and not surprised, as he truly believed in the common humanity of all people and their need for human attachments. Thank you very much. And I look forward to visiting you someday in Brazil.
Thank you very much, Myrna, for your lecture. Now we have some time for some questions. I don't know if somebody in the audience would like to ask some questions to Myrna.
Ok. Bom, gostaria. É necessário que eu fale inglês? Diretamente com ela? I will try. Okay. Thank you very much for your speech. It's a pleasure to listen you. I would like to listen about the mechanism of action of interpersonal psychotherapy. Thank you very much.
So would I. I think, that's a really good question. It's not one people who do efficacy studies or manuals really look at, but I think the mechanism of action is that if any of us are in a period of distress, we're often not the best judges of what has precipitated it. This has nothing to do with personality or genetic vulnerability, but there are things in the environment which we cannot deal with and which make us unhappy and deal with stress. And one of the things that we do in IPT is try to unwrap that. What is really troubling you in your immediate here and now? And the second thing is, how can you deal with that? And that's written in the scripts of the manual. And the third is, who in your family or your friends can help you? And the fourth is, who in your family or friends are really a source of problems that you might be able to either avoid or deal with. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's how I see it. It's demystifying the problem. And sometimes if we're in the middle of stress, we're not the best judge of what's causing it. And that's, of course, done in a therapeutic relationship. a trusting relationship. And you can do it fast. You know, sometimes you can uncover things. Oh my God, of course, I started feeling terrible when I realized my husband was having an affair. I started having headaches and not sleeping.
Thank you.
Anyone else would like to? Professor Marcelo.
Thank you for your talk. I'd like to ask you a historical question. I found that these 4 basic areas is a very brilliant insight of Dr. Clareman, and perhaps you participate in this the beginning. How these 4 basic areas was is a clinical finding or was based in any research?
Good question. Well, we were doing, that was before I went to graduate school. So, you know, I was an assistant, but we were in fact, I was in graduate school at that point, and we were in the midst of doing research on recent life events and taking the Holmes-Rahe scale and seeing what types of events were associated with the onset of depression. That work had been done for physical symptoms, but not for depression. And it was clear from that research that the most important thing was breaking of attachments, of a loss of support. And we started to try to put it into categories we did a lot of talking to one another. And we talked about what are some of the groups of attachments that we could conceptualize. We wanted to make it simpler. And of course, the first one is death. That's an obvious one. But then the second one is fighting, not getting along. That's also an obvious one. And the third was changing your life in a way either you wanted to or you was forced to. And that disrupts your social roles. And then the fourth was people who just can't get it together and they just don't have friends, or everyone in their life has died or moved and they're just lonely. So that was it was empirical in the sense that life events we showed to be related to the onset of symptoms. So that part is scientific. The other part was armchair, and knowing that it had to do with breakup attachments and how we conceptualize it with just our ideas. It's very interesting in working with you saw these diverse countries. They don't, and we really stuck it to them. I said, I don't want just an endorsement. I want to know what works and doesn't work. And the problem areas work pretty well.
We have some minutes, and I don't know if anybody else would like to ask something. So if we don't have any further questions, I would like to thank you, Myrna, very much to be here with us today, and we hope we can meet in person maybe soon.
I would like that very much. Thank you for inviting me, and have a good, successful year. No pandemics.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Deixa eu desligar. Agora, então, eu gostaria de convidar a todos a participar de um pequeno coquetel que vamos realizar para comemorar o início do ano letivo dos cursos do CELG, para compartilhar com vocês. Então, nós temos 3 cursos efetivos atualmente. O curso de Terapia Cognitivo-Comportamental, que é coordenado pelo professor Cordioli, pela Alice Xavier, pela Carolina Blaia, pela Daiane Martins e Lucas Lovato, que atualmente conta com 19 alunos. O nosso curso mais tradicional e mais antigo e com o maior número de alunos, o CEPOA, de Formação de Psicoterapia de Orientação Analítica, que é coordenado pela professora Jussara Dalzó, professor Sidney Chestat, que é Vivian Day, que atualmente conta com 67 alunos. O CAPIA, que é o curso de Psicoterapia da Infância e da Adolescência, coordenado pela professora Ana Margarete Bassols e a professora Susana Fortes, que hoje conta com 6 alunos. Então, é com muita alegria que a gente inicia esse novo ano letivo, com mais um novo curso, o curso de Terapia Interpessoal, que é coordenado por mim e pelo professor Marcelo, e que hoje, então, contou com a presença da professora Myrna como aula inaugural. Desejamos, então, um excelente ano letivo a todos, e agora vamos, então, celebrar lá no nosso coquetel. Um abraço e boa noite, e obrigado pela presença de todos.